Hello, wonderful students. I will have you watch something and maybe you might be able to hear it while I do the reaction. It's graduated cylinder. I have some vinegar in here, and this is your common white powder, also known as baking soda. Simply watch. You can see the starting to foam, foam, foam. You could hear it. Although you can't smell it, this is a very classic thing called a chemical reaction. Didn't want to spill it over the computer. And so one of the things you have to wonder is why are we even going to think about chemistry when we're looking at this whole process of biology, right? So when you think about it, chemistry and biology, why? Well, we have to think, well, if we are living organisms and we are made up of a variety of chemicals, we also know that chemistry is a vital part of biology. When we think about it, we look at the chemical reactions. This is a classic Erlenmeyer flask. Now, not all the chemicals you will encounter, all the chemical reactions, are going to occur in a particular flask at all. Rather, a lot of them occur inside the cell. As a matter of fact, inside your cell right now, there are dozens of chemical reactions occurring, whether it's metabolizing glucose, whether it is breaking down and storing various fats, whether it's rebuilding tissues that you might have damaged. Chemistry is a vital part of biology. That's step one. When we think about it, all plants, all algae, all bacteria, all of these organisms are essentially going to be carrying on these chemical reactions, whether, for example, in plants or autotrophs or other types of bacteria that can do this process called photosynthesis. They're going to be able to take these carbon dioxide molecules from the air and they're going to combine these carbon dioxide molecules and form very simple organic compounds, often in the form of glucose. And what we are in terms of humans and other animals, as well as fungi, all of these organisms that we consider heterotrophs, meaning they cannot make their own food from the sunlight and the raw ingredients around it, we need to ingest our food. When we ingest our food, we need our mouth, and from that process, we can chew the food, and then ultimately, as we're chewing it, we're making it smaller and smaller and smaller, so that these things called enzymes can break down the chemical bonds that held the food particles together. For example, right here, you can see a chemical bond here. Here's another chemical bond. Anytime you see a link between different atoms, we're going to notice a chemical bond. So essentially there are two types of organisms in this world. Those who can make their own food and those that require food from outside resources. And food is the layperson's term for chemical energy. When we think about the chemical energy, we have to look at the fact that all the food that we eat goes in, and then in the meantime, there's a lot of waste. In other words, every time we eat, this energy, even though it looks to be 100% yummy, 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 most of it is wasted. In other words, 90% of it is either going to be used as waste, wasted as heat, in the conversion of making another type of molecule called ATP. And the ATP is a substance that we're going to learn it is the cell's energy. So in other words, we consume the raw material. The cells then consume that raw material after your digestive system breaks it down, and ultimately we get energy to do other work, such as make more cells, uh, uh, replicate DNA, reset our nerves, synapses, make any type of muscle movement. All of those require ATP, which in the general part is going to be a larger thing called metabolism. And then subsequently, part of the reasons why you sweat when you run is you're developing heat. You need to cool your body off because you're metabolizing more and more of those chemicals that you have inputted into your digestive system. When we think about it, although there are many, many elements on the periodic table, the ones that we are most concerned about in terms of biology are these. This little thing called CHNOPS here. It's one way to look at it. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. We're going to see that, for example, phosphorus and sulfur are going to be key components between DNA and protein. Oxygen is just simply going to be all over with respect to helping us metabolize our food. Nitrogen is going to be a key component in terms of building proteins. Hydrogen is going to be in every type of organic compound, as is carbon. We're simply going to have a very small overview in terms of what these particular elements look like, how they are made up of in terms of what we call our subatomic particles, and then ultimately get a little bit of activity with respect to the organic molecules that are going to be part of our energy and how our bodies are going to metabolize those. Think about the subatomic particles. We think about here in terms of we got protons, neutrons, and electrons. Subatomic, really, really, really small. I know recently there's this other smaller, quirky thing that was discovered in July. I can't even pronounce it because I'm not a physicist. Check with Dr. Latier on that one. Anyway, these things are really small. What we're concerned about are the electrons, because the electrons are actually going to give the personality or the characteristics of what we say chemical reactions. And reaction RXN, that's short for reaction. These electrons, we're going to find they're going to form these different bonds, whether it's an ionic bond or whether it is going to be a covalent bond. But the electrons essentially can change depending on if it is an ionic bond or not. If it's an ionic bond, some atoms are going to gain electrons, some are going to lose electrons. The thing about it is that regardless of the chemical reaction, the protons and neutrons are going to remain the same. The only time these neutrons can change is whether or not something called an isotope is being considered. Other than that, the protons are always going to remain the same, and we're going to find later on that this is how we get our what we call our atomic number. Atomic symbol. Okay, we have all of ours. We have like the C, the H, the BR, the AU, etc. All of those are derived from the Latin form. And we also have these things called atomic mass and atomic number. The atomic mass and the atomic number are simply these components with respect to protons and neutrons together, or the number of protons within the nucleus. And as I stated before, because the atomic number or number of protons remain constant, that's where they're going to get the atomic number. So for example, if you look on the periodic table, you see 1 is helium, you see 8 is oxygen. You can derive automatically from that, oh, oxygen 8, it must have 8 protons. And that's just pretty much the overview of what we're going to look at. The one thing that we do need to see also is that within the nucleus of an atom, not to be confused with the nucleus of a cell, reside the protons and the nutrients, thus giving it the mass. Along the outside or orbiting these areas and somewhat attracted by the protons are various electrons. We're going to see that in terms of biology, there's going to be different orbitals. We're really concerned with the first 3. Max 2 electrons, the second 8 electrons, third 8 electrons. Granted, once you get into chemistry, you're going to learn more about the way that these can spin up, spin down. Don't worry about it. We're looking at 2, 8, 8. And that's going to help us decide how many electrons go into each of those orbitals. So we think, okay, electrons, they're going to be involved with the chemical bonds. That's the significant part there. They can give up, they can accept, or they can share electrons. And so when we look at those, we can maybe determine how different atoms will react in terms of what's in the outermost electron. Okay. So for example, in terms of this concept called ionic bonding, in ionic bonding, get in your head the fact that the electrons are totally given away. They're not shared. Okay, there's a concept there. They're given away, so meaning that this electron on the outer orbital here is completely lost by the sodium, and it is gained by the chlorine. When you think about it, initially there was 11 protons, and there were 11 electrons, thus giving it an overall charge of nothing. Okay, they cancel out each other, because remember, protons are positive and electrons are negative. However, if we lose one of these electrons, we now know that the overall is a +1. So sodium has this +1 charge because it has given up an electron when compared to the number of protons. On the other hand, chlorine has accepted an extra electron. Thus, what we now have is a negative charge of chlorine. Because negatives and positives attract, this attraction between these two particular atoms is called an ionic bond. Notice that the electrons did not get shared, rather the electrons got transferred. The other type of bonding is called covalent bonding. Covalent bonding, there are basically two that we might look at. One of them would be, for example, a single covalent bond. Now notice, in this case here, the electrons are being shared with the outer orbital. That's different than the previous slide where you saw the electron being transferred over. This is where we can consider sharing the electrons. The reason, in order to be fulfilled, hydrogen needs 2 electrons in that first orbital. So subsequently, they're going to share. Isn't that nice? Okay. The other part is, the other thing is, at times, every now and then we might see a double bond. When we think about a double bond, that essentially is looking at 4 electrons that are being shared, compared to a single covalent bond in which you have 2 electrons that are being shared. When we get into things like fatty fats in terms of saturated, unsaturated, that's where we're going to see a little bit more about these types of bonds. The last type of bonding that we're concerned about in biology is called the hydrogen bond. One thing to recognize is the hydrogen bond over here is a water molecule, H2O. The hydrogens are the white dots and the oxygen is the red. You notice that in between a water molecule are these dashed lines. Those dashed lines are representing the hydrogen bonds. Okay, so in other words, there's not a chemical sharing of the electrons, but rather what's going on is hydrogen, because of the way that the electrons spend more time around the oxygen molecule, it makes this oxygen slightly negative and making both the hydrogen slightly positive. Thus, we notice that the negative of one water molecule is attracted to the hydrogen of another water molecule, and that's where we get the name the hydrogen bond. We're going to see this type of hydrogen bonding in other molecules, particularly that of DNA, and some of it will also be in what we call the not the primary, but the secondary level of protein structure. So we will revisit bonds when we look at more and more types of chemical reactions. Okay. In the meantime, go ahead and read this particular material in terms of your book about chemistry and chemical bonds, and we will get back to you later with respect to some activities in class. Okay. That seems to be about it for now, and we are off.